Hey everyone, this is Jordan, one of the three hosts of the podcast Veterans for Voluntarism. We are a weekly podcast that focus on topics such as military policy, foreign policy, and libertarianism. Since we're all combat veterans, you get a perspective from people that have been there, done that differs from the typical neocon support the troops crowd. Come join us on Stitcher, Spotify, iTunes, and any other large podcatcher. Thank you for your time.
Murder and Such contains true stories about murders, the macabre, true crime, serial killers, and other dark subject matter. This includes adult themes, explicit language, descriptions of gore, violence, and other information provided by news articles, witness testimony, and public record. Murder and Such is not intended for all audiences, and although warnings will be set in place, listener discretion is still advised.
Before I kick off this episode, I want to thank all of you for your feedback from episode 58. Yeah, it was a bit different than what you're used to as far as the style that I did the episode in, but between the feedback from my supporters on Patreon and listeners like you, I found that you guys kind of like that style. So maybe I'll do some more of those kind of stories in the near future. But speaking of my patrons though, I'd like to throw a massive thank you to my newest patrons. So a big thank you to Lauren Bush, who's been a longtime supporter of the show and a listener. Another thank you to Valerie Guerrera, who is also another longtime listener of the show. And a massive thank you to Lori Ann Cake for joining the Patreon page and helping out Murder and Such as a whole. It seriously helps me out so much with getting new music, working on new t-shirt designs, and help fund more episodes. And if you'd like to donate to the Patreon, you can visit patreon.com/murderandsuch and donate for just $1 an episode. You'll get exclusive stickers, shoutouts on the episodes, and of course, you get the show early and ad-free when it's applicable. So thank you to my 3 new patrons and to the others who help fund my dream and make this show possible. You guys really are the fucking best. But if you'd like to help the show out in other ways, you can take about 30 seconds of your day and maybe leave me a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Go ahead and put anything you want in there, like Hunter forced me to do this with threat of punching my grandma in the throat. But it means so very much to me and it helps out boost my numbers and everything else. Plus, it would also offset the incels that left me 1-star reviews recently from the last episode. But still, I thank you guys even just for listening. Now, another person I'd like to give a congratulations to is a listener by the name of Steve Hayes for getting his feature film Seth and Tia out. And he even sent me a copy, so that was pretty fucking cool of you, man. Thank you again. But I hope this movie takes off for you, and I hope you keep up the great work. Thank you again for sending me a copy, and still, thank you for listening, Steve. Now, let's start getting into this a little bit. There's a decent chance that you may have a sibling. It's pretty vague, I know, but it's a very likely scenario. Siblings are something to cherish considering that your DNA is practically made from the same source. Your parents decided to get drunk at a Christmas party, knock some boots, and 9 months later, you were born. Your brother or sister may have been a 4th of July insemination, or maybe during Thanksgiving, your dad stuffed your mom's turkey. It happens, it's common, and in 2019, it said that there are typically 1.93 children per family, so hopefully you're not the 93% of a human being. So if you have a sibling, how close would you say that you are to them? Hell, with my sister, we've had our spats, fights, arguments. Even about 7 years ago, my sister and I weren't talking for quite some time, and I was an aggressive little shit back in the day. But she and I have grown together. We've been through hardships together, and although she's a smelly tree-hugging hippie, I still love her to death, and I would still do anything for my sister. That's kind of what siblings do. Or maybe you're estranged. Maybe you don't see eye to eye on everything, or get the chance to interact with them hardly at all. It goes without saying that people are busy, people have lives, careers, families of their own, and sometimes we can get sidetracked and don't have the time to connect with one another. It happens. It's not a bad thing, because it happens to us all. But that doesn't take away from the fact that there is still another person out there with almost the same DNA profile that you have. But how alike or how different can you be with your sibling? When it comes to personal views on, let's say, politics or current events, do you side with their opinion or do you stray from their beliefs? Do you call them out on their problematic behaviors? Do you push for them to make the right decisions or to be a better person? Because we all make mistakes, but our upbringing can have a definite effect on how we learn, grow, and see society as a whole. The early life and upbringings can shape and affect how we grow, learn, and our outlook even from an early age. That's not to say that if you have a bad childhood, you're going to have a bad life. But depending on your own volition, willpower, and support system, you can try to find the strength to make the very best of a bad situation. I honestly wish that that would have been the case for the story that I'm about to tell you. But as always, this pretty much never happens. This involves two brothers by the name of Reginald and Jonathan Carr, and a slew of rape, robbery, and murder spree that lasted over the beginning of December in 2000. A story of brothers who faced tragedy at an incredibly young age and the onslaught of horror that they committed later that they saw as payback for their unfortunate upbringings. One that also sparked racial fear and terror into the hearts of Wichita, Kansas citizens. But let's get into this. My name is Hunter, and you're listening to Murder and Such, and this is episode 59, The Wichita Massacre. This episode starts off in Cleveland, Ohio. November 4th of 1977, a young couple by the name of Reginald and Janice Carr had just given birth to their first son, Reginald Jr. Reginald was premature, which may be a side effect of the two of them being so incredibly young, because Reggie Jr. was born just a few months after Janice's 16th birthday, and Reginald Sr. was the same age as her. So these two were both incredibly young, but that didn't deter them from the fact that they both were incredibly in love and wanted to create a safe, prosperous, and loving family for them and their soon-to-be 3 children. Now, Reginald Sr. worked as a chemist at a local factory and made enough money to support them to the point where Janice was able to be a stay-at-home mother, and they even had gotten themselves a nice little place located in a neighborhood that also had a lot of lower middle-class families. Not long after the birth of Reginald Jr., Janice had given birth to her first daughter, a bouncing baby girl by the name of Regina. Regina was also born prematurely, and considering her mother and father were just shy of their 17th birthdays, they still had so much love and hope in their hearts to keep this family going. Now, the last person to be born was their second son, another child by the name of Jonathan. That makes the 2 culprits in this case finally being born. He was also born prematurely. It's worth noting that Jonathan was a fussy baby. He had a big cry and needed extra care when he was born due to the fact that now all 3 children had been born prematurely and were incredibly delicate. But one child was a little more delicate than the others. Shortly after her first birthday, Regina started showing some erratic signs, not like what they had seen with Reggie or Jonathan. Janice had noticed that anytime they tried holding her up to walk, she would often go completely limp to the ground. They also started monitoring her more closely, mainly due to the fact that she was showing signs of bruising on her body that weren't caused by Reggie or Jonathan, nor the parents. Then they noticed that Regina would start bleeding out of her nose for absolutely no reason. And with almost no answers to what was happening with their daughter, Janice and Reginald Sr. took Regina to the pediatric center of the Cleveland Clinic. These two young parents were working towards their own slice of the American dream when they were given the crushing news that Regina had been diagnosed with pediatric leukemia. Considering that she was also premature, her immune system was underdeveloped and she was unable to ward off hardly any infections, and there was almost nothing that either parent could really do to help their child. Cancer medications and treatments even back in the late 70s were still pretty new. Just a few days after her second birthday, Janice and Reginald Sr. lost their little girl to cancer. This was crushing. By this time, Jonathan was only about 1 year old, but he could still sense the somber overtone within the family. Reginald Sr. and Janice were lost, broken. There wasn't anything that anyone could do to help them bring back their little girl. A very rare occurrence had brought this young Ohio family to their knees, and now they were growing distant. Jonathan was said to be crying profusely, losing his big sister. His cries went into the night, and Janice did everything in her power to try to console him. Reginald Sr. attempted to go back to work. He tried to go back to his job, and it said that sometimes he would tear up out of nowhere, and he started taking extended time off to try to regain his composure. His work started slipping, and he was still trying to provide for his family, even though there were cracks starting to form in their porcelain dream. But Reginald Jr., though, it was a very different case for him. Reggie was stoic. He showed almost no emotion regarding his little sister's passing. Not only did it seem like his little sister passing didn't affect him, but he was still rambunctious, full of energy, and when his parents tried talking to him about it, they were fleeting thoughts and statements from him that he almost didn't even know who Regina was. It was somewhat uncanny, but something that definitely needed to look closer into. Granted, there's no rule book on how you're supposed to grieve or mourn, but the lack of any emotion whatsoever regarding this is a very telling sign, one that Janice and Reginald Sr. saw as disgraceful to them. They had lost their daughter, but their oldest son didn't even recognize their pain, turmoil, or even show any signs of sadness. The parents found a way to cope with their loss, and unfortunately for their remaining sons, it was something that no child should ever have to experience. Janice and Reginald started drinking profusely, and if you know anything about alcohol, it's a depressant. It's one that makes things worse, generally. Sure, it's one that a lot of people resort to in a tough time, but considering the litany of circumstances that had fallen in their laps, their drinking started getting out of control and soon started causing more harm than good for their mental state. Reginald started showing up to work less or possibly drunk, and Janice was starting to hit the bottle early in the morning. A lot of fights would ensue. Drunken and full of rage, the parents would fight with each other over whose fault it was, whether or not they should be together. But with most fights, they didn't have a for sure answer to them, so they started taking out their aggression on their two sons instead, causing even more harm to these two delicate young boys. Reginald Sr. was normally a very well-kept, very well-taken care of man who cherished his wife, his family, and his boys. But when the alcohol crept into his system, he became vindictive, vengeful, aggressive, and his neighbors had said that they even witnessed him physically abuse the children. But it's worth noting that nobody really did much about the situation because either they didn't know whether or not the kids had done anything wrong, that they saw the delicacy of the family after losing their daughter, and considering that Janice, Reginald, and the two boys were African American, there were still racial tensions around the city of Cleveland at the time, and sometimes calling the police is not necessarily a good idea. So the beatings continued and the family grew further and further apart, to the point where Reg Sr. had decided that it was beyond the point of repair, and he had decided to leave the boys with their mother, and he moved out to California. The family that started off prosperous, loving, endearing had now turned dark, shallow, violent, and soaked in alcohol until it finally broke beyond the point of repair. Janice was dumbfounded by her husband leaving, and she started drinking more alcohol. Every day, day after day, she drank herself into a stupor. With that, her mentality and moral compass degraded even further. It was said that Janice wasn't the kind of person to physically abuse the boys, but started resorting to sexually abusing the boys. This is worth noting because Reginald Jr. uses this just a few short years after the abuse occurs and warps his and Jonathan's mindset into something much more dark and sinister. The two young children have now become the product of physical, mental, emotional, and now sexual abuse. Reggie being a lot more cold and callous, and Jonathan being the one that showed a lot more emotion. But Reggie had taken this on himself to start becoming Jonathan's mentor and almost of a father figure to John. With his father being completely out of the picture, John needed someone to look up to, so he confided in his older brother, even though his brother had no real-life experience or form of guidance for his younger brother. But the only guidance that Reggie had was received either from his father's abusive actions or from seeing it on the real world or in television, which, let's just say, those aren't the best parental outlets, which can shape and evolve a highly impressionable mind in some very horrible ways. With Janice being burdened by her two boys and Reg Sr. not being around to help out, she started enlisting the help of friends and family members to help take care of the two boys, almost like she was playing hot potato with these children of her own. Her alcoholism never really dissolved, and she relied on her addiction to get her through her day-to-day life. She did try to retain some jobs, but the cost of taking care of her two boys with no support from their father proved to be too much for her, and the boys spent more time with other families than with their own mother. Considering stability wasn't something in their life at this point, the brothers started looking inward towards the only constant that was in their lives, which was each other. Reggie, only being 2 years older than John, baked into John's mind that he was pretty much his father by this point, that he was the guided one who had all of the answers that he was looking for, even though he was far too young at this point to have any sort of power over his younger brother. Reggie started dabbling with alcohol, sort of a copycat thing that he learned from his parents, by the age of just 9. Much too young to be drinking anything alcoholic at the time. Adolescent drinking can result in a multitude of issues. Not only can it impair one's ability to reason, it can cause accidents, overdoses, or difficulties at school and emotional issues, but the long-term side effects from drinking so much at such a young age can result in effects such as memory loss, learning disabilities, impaired cognitive and physical development, increased depression and anxiety, moving on to harder drugs, develop dependency on alcohol, and cause extreme risky behaviors. I wish I could say that they didn't suffer from any of these issues, but they did, unfortunately. And here's what each boy was known to be showing signs of. Considering John was so young with his sister passing away, it's safe to say that he was a little more emotionally developed than Reggie was. But due to the nature of what was happening after Regina passed away, the family separation, and his brother calling the shots now, it's safe to say that nobody had attempted to try and intervene with any mental health specialist at his young age. John suffered from depression extremely hard, and Reggie only fueled his depression by mixing in wine and Kool-Aid to try and cut out the harsh overtones. Now Reggie was still emotionally underdeveloped and only cared about being assertive and dominant. He was still a kid, but even in his childhood mentality, he knew that if he couldn't earn what he wanted, he would learn how to take it. He was known to acquire wine and liquor from a local convenience store by usually stealing it or taking alcohol from whoever he and his brother were staying with at the time. But where John usually felt somber and depressed, a lot of what Reggie would do would be on the opposite end of the spectrum and usually turned violent and vicious. He lost his innocence at a very young age with the degradation of his family, and he wanted to make the world pay for it. Reggie's actions wouldn't just be physically fighting with kids in elementary school with him, but he had his first sexual experience at a very young age. Reggie had convinced a young neighborhood girl to have sex with him only being 9 years old. But that was something that he also tried to pass down to Jonathan, but John saw it was wrong at first until Reggie asserted his dominance over him and forced him to rape a young girl that he had incapacitated with alcohol. This was something that never went on to any police reports or charges. This definitely affected John. Still battling with his depression and no healthy outlet for him, John had fashioned himself a makeshift noose with an electrical cord and attempted to hang himself. This child is only 7 years old and attempted suicide. I've hardly ever heard that any child, let alone that young, trying to kill themselves. But this was also the 1980s, and mental health was still not taken very seriously back then. Now, I can't say what compelled him to undo the cord from his neck, possibly a survival instinct. But John had failed to take his own life, but still returned to the desolate and destructive lifestyle that had been placed on him. And obviously, somewhat living in fear of his brother, he never told Reggie about his suicide attempt. To be honest, if my brother, who is 2 years older than me, was showing the same signs that Reggie was showing, I would most definitely keep any sort of weakness to myself, because as time went on, Reggie got more and more aggressive and violent, both sexually and physically. It was said that almost every day, Reggie would pick a fight with someone at school, or even his guardians that were trying to take care of him. He had felt so much pain and anguish early in his childhood that he wanted to make anyone and everyone who crossed his path pay for it. Multiple classmates were left bruised and bloodied as a result of his anger, and there was little to no moral compass for Reggie when it came down to who deserved what kind of beatings in his own mind. Anyone who'd stood in front of him either caught a verbal or physical onslaught at the hands of this child. Multiple attempts were made to try to help him with his aggression, but even if he showed signs of wanting to change, something would spark the violence within his mind and he would continue lashing out. He was suspended at one point for sexually harassing his teacher, because his thirst for sexual contact was also turning into its own monster. In school, he would grope or put female classmates up against the wall and threaten them. He also did this for Jonathan. There are a few times where he set up a sexual encounter with a female student and forced John to have sex with her. That also would play more into John's depression and somber mentality. With reports coming back from the multitude of schools that the boys had attended, Janice was losing hope for what it was that she could do to help them out. So she had contacted a family friend in the city of Dodge City, Kansas, to help intervene and take care of the boys. So Janice drove halfway across the country to drop them off and left them with this woman who was known to Janice to be a beacon of moral high ground and help rehabilitate the boys so they could finally get a good grasp on reality and live flourishing lifestyles. I'd like to make a note here where this could have been a tipping point for the boys. They were both using sex and alcohol and drugs for their own reasons. The fuel to Reggie's fire, and hopefully the extinguisher for John's depression. Their unfortunate lifestyles had developed their brains in a horrible way at this point. Sure, with the right sort of intervention, medical treatment, and moral basis can turn someone's life around. But this is the perfect storm of unfortunate happenings. Children of a broken home and a livelihood that stood teetering on the edge of a cliff. This tipping point would prove unsuccessful for them. As they got older, they started facing more and more consequences for their actions. This new guardian, this woman, had taken them to church, but Reggie had indoctrinated John to believe that the reasons why sex and drugs felt good was that it was supposed to be there for them to use at their disposal. He had taught him that there was no salvation in the teachings of Jesus, and that the only redemption they were owed was one that they would have to take back by force. Even attempts at getting them involved in local community efforts would often result in missed appointments or days without communication. They were enrolled in a local high school, but by the time, Reggie only cared about appeasing his own self-interest, mainly sex, drugs, and money. He had used his younger brother at some local liquor stores to help play the decoy and keep the clerk busy while he stole liquor and cigarettes from behind the counter and off of the shelves. But sometimes he would take it further and rob the stores of any money that he could get his hands on. He either used the alcohol for he and his brother's consumption, or he would try to sell it to other high schoolers to enjoy. But there would be a few times where he would not bring the smokes or booze with him and would instead beat the person senseless and rob them of whatever money that he could. This young man was unstoppable, and his rage only grew over time, with little to nothing holding him back, not even his little brother. Hell, school didn't even stop him from becoming the young monster that he was. So at the age of 15, Reggie had dropped out and decided to just focus on money and women, the only things that ever brought him happiness. So he continued to strong-arm anyone that he could get what he wanted from, but not 1 year later he would find himself in the same situation that his dad did at the same age. Since he really didn't have a moral compass, he also didn't believe in having protected sex with women, so he became a father, just like his own, at the age of 16. Now, coming from experience of some of my friends who have had children at a very young age, one might think that when you bring a child into this world, you would try to turn your life around, even if not for yourself, but for the sake of your child. But of course, Reggie wasn't affected by that. Sure, he knew that he had a kid, but he continued to rob and beat anyone that he could, and would sometimes give the mother of his child a visit, sometimes showering her in gifts or money to help raise his child. But he really didn't care about that child. So instead of getting a job, he went by his own code and got whatever he needed by any means necessary. He had been charged as a minor for assault and battery stemming from one of his brawls, but there was little to nothing you could do to a 16-year-old child. Even the woman that he was living with had tried to talk to him about possibly sending him away to get rehabilitated, but she would be met with verbal and physical threats that would chill anyone to the bone. By this time, it wasn't just alcohol that he was dealing with. He was finding himself closer entwined with local drug dealers, and he was used primarily as an enforcer. He would take anything he could get his hands on at that point. Weed, alcohol, cigarettes, cocaine, anything and everything that could make him some money. The beatings and robberies continued, and the lavish lifestyle and trying to fly under the radar of the police and getting anything that he wanted in his life by brute force was everything that he and his younger brother wanted. However, a year later, when Reggie was 17 years old, he was looking for some money and decided to head to a bookstore and attempted to rob the place. The police were nearby, and someone had told them that there was a man screaming about money inside of the store. So when the police arrived, they ordered Reggie to the ground and had found weed on him and arrested him for possession and attempted robbery. However, since he was 17, the judge looked at all the circumstantial evidence. This was the first time that he had really gotten himself in trouble, that they knew of. And the defense had pleaded that he had a very troubled life, home life, and persuaded the judge to give him his first and only deferred sentence, and instead of doing jail time, they gave him probation instead. Now, if you don't know, a deferred sentence is usually a one-time deal. It's your first charge as kind of a legal adult, and it's somewhat of a mulligan. Usually, depending on the crime, a person can get probation and sometimes community service for their charge. I'm not gonna lie, I've talked on the show before about how I was arrested at the age of 20 for second-degree theft. You guys pretty much know that I'm not some innocent victim of circumstance, and I fully admitted to the theft charge. But considering it was my first offense, I was given 2 years probation and had to pay restitution back from what I stole from the Kmart that I worked at 12 years ago. I fucked up, I owned up to my crime, and I paid the money back, and I finished out my probation with no issues. Since then, I've kept my ass on the straight and narrow path, and even though that my hometown Kmart is finally closing their doors in February of 2020, I still have remorse for what I did. I was not innocent in that case. But Reggie, however, didn't have any remorse. Since he was still on probation, he didn't think that maybe he should clean up his act for himself and possibly his child, but he decided that he was going to break into somebody's house. Fortunately, the owners were not home, so they didn't get beaten, but the neighbors had seen him busting through a window, so they called the police, and the police arrested Reggie again for not only burglary, but they also found more drugs on him. This, obviously, is a violation of his probation. Now by this time, Reggie was a pretty well-known name to the Dodge City Police Department, and the judge wasn't so lenient. Considering he let Reggie off easy the first time, but he obviously didn't learn his lesson, the judge sentenced him to a year of time behind bars. The entire trial, Reggie was stoic and showed no remorse for what he had done. He was already hardened by this time, and Jonathan was about to endure a year without the one person who hadn't abandoned him his entire life. Jonathan was lost, broken, depressed, confused, and started drinking more and more to himself. He wasn't in with the guys that Reggie would run with, doing drug deals, getting women, or hard partying, so he secluded himself to his room, just waiting for the day that his brother would finally be released. When you're 16, safe to say that you never really have your life figured out. Shit, I'm twice that age and I'm still trying to figure my shit out. I've got a good job, I talk to you guys on the internet, tell you horrifying tales, and I think I have a 401k. At least until the economy crashes again like they've been talking about this year. But when you're 16, what do you typically think that life is like? Depending on where you live, by 16, you usually have gotten your full driver's license with maybe a year of probation where you're not supposed to have any moving violations. You're most likely a freshman or a sophomore in high school. Maybe you've got a significant other, or maybe you might even be sexually active. Maybe you're involved in some school activities, some sports, studying for tests, dealing with typical bullshit high school drama, or smoking a bowl with your friends. Whatever you do, it's fine. Everyone is different. But compare all of that to Jonathan. I don't think that he had a driver's license at this point, but maybe he had already known how to drive a car. He had been sexually active from a very young age, and he had been smoking weed, drinking, partying, all of those things that you don't typically experience until maybe you just get into high school. But he was doing a lot of those things at a very young age. We're all young and dumb at points in our lives, and we all make mistakes. But this guy has experienced most of what kids his age have already experienced, but a lot younger than what they are. But one thing that he was no longer experiencing was the one constant in his life, which was his brother, Reggie. Reggie was in jail, and John didn't know what to do with himself. His father figure and mentor was going to be out of his life in a physical form for at least a year, and he had no direction and no clue what to do without him. He had dropped out of school by this point and had attempted to hold multiple jobs in the meantime, but he wasn't so much of a swindling and robbing type that his brother was. He drifted in and out of places to work, but since his brain was so underdeveloped, it was hard for him to focus and maintain a noble way of life. This spearheaded his depression even further, to the point where Jonathan had made a second attempt at taking his own life. So Jonathan went to the store and bought himself some antifreeze, using what little money he had. Jonathan secluded himself inside of his room and proceeded to drink the antifreeze, hoping to die from the toxicity of the fluid. Luckily, he was found and he was rushed to a nearby hospital where they had pumped his stomach of all of the chemical, thus thwarting his attempt at suicide for a second time. This man was so saddened with the lost direction of his brother, the pain he inflicted on others, and the hand that he was dealt as a child that he just wanted the pain to stop. But he lived instead, and he decided to wait for Reggie to be released from prison.
Wondery Plus presents its newest podcast, Deadly Misadventures, hosted by Justin from Generation Y and Tyler from the Minds of Madness.
We'll bring you some of the most terrifying real-life stories of those who came face to face with death,
some who lived to tell the tale,
while others succumbed to their deadly misadventures.
Doing bad things.
you know the odds. The stakes are high.
Care to take your chance with Lady Luck?
To hear all Deadly Misadventure episodes exclusively ad-free, just visit Wondery.fm/deadly to start listening now.
Doing bad things to you.
Speaking of which, Reggie's time in prison could have been a time for him to try to set himself straight. He was a first-time felon, and he could have utilized this year behind bars to set himself on a better track. I can't say much about what jails are like in the mid-90s, but usually there's always a program to help someone who's young and disenfranchised try to get on a better path. But we're also talking about Reggie after all. And Reggie found himself in with a lot of like-minded individuals in prison. From what he showed, he learned on the streets about how to get what you wanted from people. But when you toss a guy with his mentality into a group of other convicted felons, you know that he's going to absorb all of the knowledge that he can about taking advantage of those on the outside. It would almost seem like this was the only time where he tried taking teachings seriously. While in prison, he was reprimanded for fighting with other inmates, and there was an incident with a female corrections officer where he was punished for flashing her his penis while inside of his jail cell, none of which added any additional time to his stay. But he was sent to solitary confinement one time for beating an inmate so badly with another group of inmates that the person received brain damage and had to undergo surgery for his wounds. He learned from the pros how to properly rob someone and avoid detection. He also learned when and where he could find some weapons if he needed them, how to hijack cars, and how to craft his drug dealing enterprise even further. He took all this information with him when he finished out his year sentence, and when he got out, he only wanted 3 things: money, women, and revenge for the time that he spent behind bars and for a society who he had thought had wronged him. When Reggie got out, John was anxiously awaiting him on the outside of the prison walls, most likely shaking to his core for his failed attempt at committing suicide and unsure about who his brother had become on the inside. They got into the car and drove off to a friend's house. By this time, Jonathan was staying on friends' couches and crashing wherever would let him stay, as he was ostracized by the woman who took them both in. A life that even Reggie was well accustomed to before he even went to jail. Reggie started working on the new set of skills that were taught to him by the inmates, mostly starting with small robberies and burglaries, but because of the new lessons he learned, he was able to avoid detection, and if anyone did find out who he was, he would beat them senseless, usually losing any recollection of who or how they would have been beaten. With Reggie's newfound anger and power, he started working away on Jonathan himself. Reggie was almost like a morbid pastor, and Jonathan was his malleable one-man congregation. He indoctrinated him with hatred, a hatred stemming from a rough childhood, an absent father, an unjust legal system that took him away from a year, and a world that was out to get them both. He was Jonathan's father figure, his mentor, the ringleader, and the architect to his own personal hell. He was the only constant person in his life, and he assured him that he was never going to let go ever again. Not only were they brothers, but they were also blood. The next few years weren't filled with much, except for some small-time drug deals, robberies of local convenience stores, and the rest of the 90s were mainly spent with each other, and some other small-time criminals. There was booze, money, cars, drugs, and with these two still being in their early 20s, there wasn't much that could really stop them. They didn't want to try to finish out school, try to turn their lives around, or try to become productive members of society. If they saw something they wanted, they would figure out a way to get it by any means necessary. One night, the brothers found themselves at a nightclub in Dodge City. Of course, they had their entourage with them, but Reggie had found himself an unlikely target. A nurse, who was not named by any legal documents, was at the club, and with them, she was covered in some very valuable clothes and jewelry. With Reggie seeing the clothes and jewelry that she was wearing, he found himself a new person to talk to, and she found herself not only smitten by Reggie, but he was also seeing her as an opportunity for his own self-interest. Since she was so well-dressed, groomed, and now in the palm of his hands, she disclosed to them that she made some pretty decent money, and she knew where some of the most prosperous parts of her hometown were located. Her hometown was nearly 2.5 hours east of Dodge City in Wichita, Kansas. After they had met up a few more times after the nightclub, the brothers had decided that they've had enough of Dodge City and the police, and they headed off to Wichita to try to make a big score. Now that takes us to the fall of 2000. The brothers had been staying with Reggie's girlfriend at the time, but instead of trying to find jobs and pull their shit together, they started scouting out the town. With a car they had gotten from running drugs, they started driving around the neighborhoods on the east side of Wichita. Now the east side was mostly known for having more of an predominantly white upper-class neighborhood. They started looking particularly at cars around the area because they believed if you had a nice car, the brothers thought that they had a lot of money, which is typically not the case, even in the early 2000s. Most people kept a lot of their money in banks or used credit cards rather than keeping a ton of cash at them at all times. Hell, even Y2K at the beginning of the year wasn't a real threat to anyone, and the banks didn't sink into the ocean like they fucking predicted. But that was something that they counted on. Even though they may not have cash on them, they still had money in one way or another. Now, I did mention there was some racial tension in the Wichita area at this time. I'm going to be reading you the fact part of the Supreme Court of Kansas, which was the state of Kansas versus Cornelius Devin Oliver. And that was decided on December 16th of 2005, although this murder spree took place on December 7th of 2000. Here's what that document says. Quote, investigations of the murders at the center of this case began when a Wichita police officer was dispatched to a house on a shooting complaint. Inside of the house, the officer found 4 dead bodies. The bodies of Jermaine Levy, Quincy Williams, Odessa Ford were in the front room, and Rashonda Wheaton's body was found in a bedroom. Levy was sitting on the floor, leaning against a couch. 2 bullets fired from a .380 semi-automatic handgun were recovered from his body. The points of entry were the lower left side of his head and the lower left side of his neck. One of his pockets was pulled out. Williams was facing a television and sitting on another couch. He had been shot 3 times, twice with a .38 special revolver and once with a .380 handgun. Williams's entry wounds were on the top left side of his head, above his left eyebrow, and in the center lower area of his head. A bullet was found underneath Williams that had been fired from a .38 revolver. Ford was lying on her back on the floor. She had been shot in the head with a .38 revolver from 3 to 6 feet away. Investigators found no defensive wounds on these 3 victims. In the bedroom, there was a bullet hole in the doorway to the closet and in the wall. These bullets had been fired from a .38 revolver. Wheaton was sitting behind a wall and a bed. She had a pillow clutched to her face and there were 2 bullet holes in the pillow. Wheaton sustained a graze wound on the left hand and a graze wound on her left cheek, which were classified as defensive wounds. Another shot went through her wrist. She'd also been shot in the top of her head at close range. These bullets were fired by the .380 handgun. Various shell casings from the .380 handgun were found at other points of the house. Police also found a live .380 round. The markings on it were consistent with a misfeed. Jesse Hardyway, a friend of Williams, arrived at the house before police. He testified that a video game was on the television on pause and that Williams had a video controller in his hand. Hardaway also testified that Ford was selling drugs for the defendant out of her house. Another person who entered the house testified that he took the adapter to the video game. In the bedroom, a ceiling tile had been moved. The police recovered a small amount of drugs and money from the ceiling. Before arresting defendant Oliver, the police knew he and Wheaton shared a violent romantic history. They also knew Oliver was a gang member and Levy and Williams were affiliated with a rival gang. The police were wary, however, of assuming the crimes were gang-related. Neither Levy nor Williams had been in defensive positions, and each appeared to have been shot from behind. Further, the killing of the 2 women, while not unheard of, would have been rare in a gang crime. The police therefore decided to explore robbery and domestic violence in addition to the gang theory as motives for the murder. There had been no forced entry, and the investigation concluded that the shooter was probably someone familiar with the victims. While at the crime scene, a police officer had received a sheet of paper with the defendant's name written on it from an unidentified person. Now, I'm going to skip ahead a bit, but at this point, the police decided to arrest Oliver. One officer testified that, because Oliver had yet to surface and inquire about Wheaton, police feared that he might leave town before he could be questioned. The officer sent to arrest Oliver found him on his brother's porch. Oliver was wearing pants and a sleeveless tank top, which seemed odd to the officers because it was December and cold outside. The officers observed Oliver from their car until he started to leave the porch. Then they arrested him. One of the officers testified that he observed blood on the toes of Oliver's shoes. Other clothing belonging to Oliver was found in the garage. Blood from both Oliver and Levy was found on that clothing. Other bloodstains on the clothing could not be identified. After his arrest, Oliver was placed in an interview room for 45 minutes. His shoes were taken and he was shackled to the floor and handcuffed to the table. He was given Miranda warnings and agreed to speak with officers. After giving different variations of what Oliver had done to these people, he finally was charged with 1 count of first-degree premeditated murder for the killing of Levy, and then 3 counts of capital murder for the killings of Williams, Ford, and Wheaton. Now this definitely sets the tone for Wichita at the time, considering that this is the largest murder occurrence within 27 years. This shook Wichita to its core. And it's worth noting that there is a lot of criticism when it comes to the press about this, but Cornelius Devin Oliver was a young African-American male. After the trial, the jury convicted Oliver of first-degree premeditated murder in the killings of the 2 men, Levy and Williams, and of felony murder in the killing of the 2 women, Ford, and Wheaton. The district court sentenced Oliver to 2 consecutive hard 50-year sentences for the first-degree premeditated murder convictions and then 2 consecutive life sentences on the 2 felony murder convictions. There was no way that Cornelius Oliver was getting out of jail. But just remember that these murders occurred on December 7th of 2000 and shook Wichita, Kansas to its core. Now I'm going to get back to the brothers on this because this happened on December 8th of 2000. A man by the name of Andrew Schreiber was pumping gas at a local gas station. He had been known to be somewhat of a baseball superstar who played for the local college. He drove a nice SUV, which was something that the brothers were obviously paying attention to. He had a good car, so he must have good money. Andrew was actually the assistant baseball coach at the local university. But at about 9:15 that night, at the gas station on the northeast side of Wichita, the brothers had kept tracking Andrew as he was getting gas. They also had with them a handgun that they purchased back in Dodge City before leaving for Wichita. After filling up his car, he went inside to grab a couple of things, probably some snacks and drinks as it was late in the evening. When getting his items, he started back towards his freshly filled car, but he could tell that something was a little bit off. He stopped at his car, unlocked the door, and turned around to find himself being greeted with Reggie and a loaded handgun. Reggie ordered him inside of the car, and he hopped in the back seat, holding the pistol to Andrew's head, sometimes striking him. Reggie ordered him to empty his pockets inside of the car. There was little to no cash value, but even Reggie knew that just because he didn't have much cash on him didn't mean that he didn't have any cash to his name. So he ordered Andrew to drive the car, and that's when he looked back and he saw that he was being followed by another car. This one was being driven by Jonathan, who was there to keep tabs on the both of them. Reggie ordered Andrew to head to various ATMs and get out as much money as possible. They did this multiple times until it seemed that there was no more money to be gotten. ATMs at the time didn't have the $400 limits that are instated by a lot of bank institutions these days, so Andrew was forced to exhaust all that he could or be killed in the process. So he got the brothers what they wanted, and then they forced him to do another thing. Reggie told Andrew to drive the SUV to the outskirts of town. Fearing for his life, of course he complied. When he got to an empty parking lot towards the northern part of Wichita, both cars stopped and both brothers got out of the cars and pulled Andrew out of the driver's seat by his shirt. They dragged him to the side of the car where they forced him on his knees. The guy was showered in fear and uncertainty of the two men who had held his life in their hands. Reggie cocked back the gun and chambered around, sweat most likely pouring out of Andrew's head despite the cold December weather. And then a single gunshot went off into the cold winter night. The brothers then got into Jonathan's car and started to take off, but not before the single bullet hitting the SUV's tire instead of hitting Andrew in the head. They instead had pistol whipped him in the back of the head and left him alive next to his SUV. When Andrew regained his composure, he limped himself and his car back to the city limits and reported the incident to the police. ATM footage did not show the brothers on the camera whatsoever, as Reggie kept himself in the car, a lesson that he learned from the inmates when he was incarcerated with them. But considering the brothers were new to the Wichita area, they had no prior convictions inside of the city limits, and nobody really knew who they were. The police asked the community for any sort of help that they could get, usually reciting the make and model of the car that Andrew remembered them driving, but also wondering if there was some sort of retaliation as the Oliver shootings that had just happened on the previous day. Little did they know that these brothers just kicked off a spree of crime that would soon become known to the public as the Wichita Massacre. Now, the brothers made out pretty well with their robbery of Andrew Schreiber. They had money, so they spent it on whatever would feed their addictions, whether it was more guns, booze, drugs, women, or just partying it up in their new home. They only looked out for themselves and didn't trust many more people except for each other, still remaining true to the one constant in their life, them being brothers. But they didn't invest their money into something that would have a good return for them. Still high on the kidnapping and robbery they just committed, the brothers lived it up until their personal well ran dry. That's when they started looking for another way to replenish their funds. On the evening of December 11th of 2000, the brothers were out looking for their next victim. They found themselves in the neighborhood where a 55-year-old woman by the name of Ann Walenta had lived. Ann was a very upstanding member of society. She was a librarian by day, a mother of two, and was even a cellist with the local symphony. She had just gotten home shortly after 9 p.m. that night and was sitting in her car ready to go into her house when she noticed something. A large African-American male starting towards her very late in the evening. Considering the tensions at the time when it came to gang violence and Ann living in a predominantly white neighborhood, she was taken aback. But the one thing that took her back even further was when she noticed the man, 22-year-old Reggie, holding up a handgun and pointing it at her car. Ann was scared for her life at this point, so she decides to put the car in drive and hit the gas pedal, but swerves to miss the man pointing the gun at her. But with the car speeding past Reggie, he finally tipped over the edge, and instead of aiming for a tire, he decides to point the gun straight at the driver's side window and pulls the trigger 3 times, striking Ann in the chest. The car continues down the road, and Ann goes limp on the steering column until her car comes to a rest 3 houses down from her own. The sound alerts the neighbors, and Reggie runs back to the car with Jonathan, and they both decide to get the fuck out of the area. The neighbors find Ann slumped over her steering wheel and call the police, which also alert the ambulance. Ann is rushed to a local hospital where she clings to her life, but it would be 3 days later that Ann would finally succumb to her injuries, and she would later die on December 14th of 2000. But before she passed, she attempted to give the police any identifying information about her attacker, but considering the time of night, there was little to no descriptors that she could give them that would help them track down her killer. Now the police are at a loss at this time, considering the murders just days prior. And not only with this woman being shot by her own house, but also with Andrew being kidnapped and robbed of most of his money. They're still wondering if there's any connection between all of them, or if they're all just one-off assault robberies, and that the quadruple homicide wasn't connected to these violent outbursts, leaving victims and bodies in their wake. That finally brings us to the 14th of December of 2000. The brothers start drinking in the early afternoon, using what little money they had left from the kidnapping and robbery, but they knew that they had to make another score to keep themselves afloat. The drinking continues, and they start plotting their next move. Considering that they had made it out of both Andrew and Ann's assault and murder without being caught, they knew that they had to work under the cover of the night to avoid someone getting an accurate description of what the brothers had looked like. So they start driving around the nicer parts of the city, and they happen to come across a luxury SUV that was leaving a very upscale restaurant. A mother of one, alone, in a fancy car, just looking to go home. So they start following her around and keeping their heads down and trying to avoid detection. Now, chances are, you've felt some kind of an odd feeling about cars when you're behind the wheel. You know how you sometimes feel like maybe you're being tailed for a little bit too long, or maybe it feels like somebody is following you, and it leaves kind of like a sinking feeling in your stomach? Well, luckily for this woman, she had the same feeling and started making different turns at different areas of her neighborhood on the east side of Wichita, trying to avoid this car from following where she was going and hopefully lose them in the process. Now, when she finally had enough of the brothers, she called her daughter from her cell phone and told her to open the garage door to the house. The daughter complied, and the woman ended up speeding away and finally getting into her garage and shutting the door, somewhat losing the brothers in the process. Now, fortunately for the woman, she got away, but the brothers still headed towards where she went and decided that a single part of this 3-part townhouse complex was the one that she lived in. But unfortunately for the occupants in this house, they were about to meet the brothers from hell. They picked the one house thinking that it was the home of the woman that they had been tailing for the better part of an hour, but it wasn't. Inside were 5 college friends: Brad Heike, Heather Muller, Aaron Sander, Jason Beffert, and Jason's girlfriend, a woman whose name has been omitted from being released. In the book Wichita Massacre, written by Fred Rosen, and in the episode of Evil Kin named No Remorse, she's been referred to as Monica Fleming, but she has also been simply referred to as Holly G in some other outlets. All of these friends were located in the townhouse at 12727 East Birchwood Drive. The friends were high school and college friends, all of them in their 20s who had found successful careers after graduating college, with Brad and Aaron getting jobs at a local oil company. Heather was Aaron's girlfriend, and she worked as a preschool teacher, and although they were both Roman Catholic, Heather was considering becoming a nun with her local church, and Aaron had been considering leaving the oil company and joining the priesthood as well. Now, Jason was a high school football star who eventually decided to stay with the high school and work for the school itself as a teacher, with someday hoping to become married to Monica, in which she was also a teacher. He was looking to propose to her soon, and he had with him a diamond engagement ring. Now, these 5 friends were living the best time of their lives with each other, friends from school and friends even throughout their adulthood, the kind of non-blood family kind of get together that they're sharing their stories of life, love, and work, and just enjoying another person's company. But as the night grew longer, Jason and Monica decide to head upstairs to the bedroom and head to bed. It was now nearly 11 o'clock in the evening, and everyone is starting to wind down, and they were starting to put a cap on this Thursday night hangout. But what would unfold next would be the most terrifying experience that no friends should ever have to endure. With Reggie and John still looking for the woman that narrowly lost them, the brothers walked up to the door of the 5 friends and knocked. When the door opened, they hoped to find the woman in the SUV, but instead were met by Brad. Reggie held the gun up to Brad's face and barged inside the door with his brother following closely behind. They locked the door and ordered the 3 friends onto the floor. Reggie called all the shots at this time and asked if there was anybody else in the house. Brad had said that there were still 2 people upstairs, and Reggie took himself up there, grabbed Jason and Monica, then brought them down with the rest, with Jonathan keeping an eye on the 3 downstairs and ordered them to remove their clothes. When they did that, he rummaged through their pockets to try to get any money that he could, meanwhile also using their naked bodies as a deterrent from them to run outside and brace the cold with no clothing. When Reggie got the other 2 downstairs, he also ordered them to do the same, stripping them of their clothes and their humanity, leaving them humiliated, crying, and fearful on the ground of a bedroom in the middle of the house. Now came the interrogation. With the time Reggie spent behind bars, he was told that most people who have a lot of cash typically have a safe within the walls of their house. He grabs Brad and pistol whips him in the head, demanding him to tell him where the safe is. But Brad didn't have a safe, and there was no safe within the house at all. The only things of value they had were eventually found when they ordered the friends into a closet while they ransacked the property looking for anything of value. It didn't matter if it was watches, jewelry, cash, or anything at all. They were going to use these 5 people to their advantage and get anything and everything from them that they could. When ransacking the house, they found the diamond engagement ring hidden pretty well inside of a tin. Considering these people were kind of upper middle class, When Jonathan found the ring, he knew that it was a diamond, as he used it to scratch a piece of glass, and it actually left a mark. They took that, but still weren't satisfied with the haul that they had. So they head back to the closet and ask the question, who has bank cards? The tactic was used by them before with Andrew Schreiber. Jonathan kept watch over the others while Reggie took the friends one by one to local ATMs and exhausted all of the money that they had in their bank accounts. He even used Jason's truck to load up each individual and take them to grab their money. They got a bunch of money from Andrew the first time, so they could only guess how much money they could get out of not just one, but 5 individuals who lived modest and somewhat prosperous lives. Each time he came back when the accounts were withdrawn and showed Jonathan the wad of cash that he forced out of the people. One by one, it was not only more money, but more depravity for the brothers to have in their hands. But one thing was different from the other robbery they committed. They weren't working under the guise of night. They were inside and they could see their faces. You know damn well that if you're being held at gunpoint, you'd know what these people look like. You'd study their faces, and you'd study any sort of characteristics that you could give to a police sketch analyst. When Monica had asked them if they were going to kill them, Reggie had responded to her that he wasn't going to kill them, but he just wanted their money, and if they complied, they would be let free to go. But that's not to say that he and Jonathan didn't want more than money. With them being stripped naked upon return from the ATMs, John had finally switched from the side of being the more emotionally sensitive of the brothers to finally falling over the edge and becoming a violent offender at this point. He took Monica into the bathroom and raped her while Reggie held the others at gunpoint. But when he was done, he let Reggie go in and do the same exact thing to her. Then they did the same thing to Heather, each taking their turns, raping and sodomizing her. Their depravity had sunk even further to the point where they took the women out of the bathroom and forced the men to perform oral sex on the women that they had just raped. If the men resisted, the brothers would take turns beating them with a golf club that they had found when they ransacked the house. No longer was this sort of a simple robbery, but this was something much more sinister, soaked in control and power, and proving that the brothers to both become the monsters that they would be known as today. When they were done, they forced everyone out of the house and into the garage. They stuffed all 3 men into the trunk, stacked one on top of the other, and then threw Heather into the back seat of the car. Monica was forced into Jason's truck with Reggie, and then they left the property and headed out of town towards a construction site, and next to it was a soccer field. No houses to be found around the area, and nobody to hear what was about to happen. When they got there, they got all 5 of the friends onto the snow and ice covered soccer field. A place that children would gather and compete in the warmer months was now about to become a crime scene, the likes that the Wichita police would never hope to experience. One by one, the brothers lined up each of the friends on their knees, facing away from the cars and the brothers. These people scared and begging for their lives, just wanting to go home and back to their loved ones. Jonathan and Reginald proceeded to shoot each of the 5 friends in the back of the head, execution style, and left their bodies falling forward to the ground, ending their young lives. Or so they thought. But that wasn't the end of this. They each received 1 to 2 shots to the back of the head. The number varied depending on the victim. But after they were done trying to execute them, Reggie got into Jason's truck, and before heading back onto the road, he proceeded to drive over the line of bodies, ensuring that he had fully taken their lives away. When they were done, he and Jonathan got back onto the roads in their stolen vehicles and headed back to the house of hell that they had just created, thinking to themselves that they just got away scot-free. However, Monica was only grazed, and she wasn't killed by the truck either. When she came to, she found that Brad, Heather, and Aaron were all dead, but Jason was merely clinging to life and still breathing. He was in fact shot in the head, but he was still conscious, but it was most definitely a race against time, and Monica was about to face nearly a mile of terrain between her and any sort of human life. She, although injured, made it to the nearest house and begged for help. The family inside was horrified at what had happened to this woman begging at their doorstep. They immediately called the police and emergency services, which headed out as soon as humanly possible. When the police arrived at the scene, they found that it was too late for Jason, and he had succumbed to his injuries and died at the scene. They took Monica to the hospital, but before trying to put her under anesthesia for her injuries, she wanted to tell the police everything that she knew. It wasn't long before the news broke that there had been 4 people slain outside of the city in a soccer field, and that's when the media started their manhunt as well. When the news was on TV, they had a small description of the victims and the perpetrators. They were described as 2 black men in their early 20s, one with dreadlocks and one that was bald, and they considered them armed and extremely dangerous. But with the media still in a spin about Ann Walenta being murdered by a black man, and with Andrew Schreiber also being robbed and kidnapped by a black man, the media put their own little spin on this case that would prove more harmful than good. But the brothers, upon returning to the house, they had decided to take anything else of value that they could from Jason's home. When there, they continued to look for anything of value and beat Monica's dog to death with a golf club. They took televisions, electronics, jewelry, watches, and anything else that they could pawn and started stashing it into the back of their cars. This took them multiple hours to get everything that they wanted, and considering that they were convinced that they had killed all 5 friends, they had no idea about the manhunt that was soon to follow them in the early morning hours. The police issue an alert to the citizens of Wichita, telling them what the brothers looked like, the type of descriptions of each of the cars that they had stolen from the house, but there was something that Reggie never learned from when he was inside the prison walls, was how to stay ahead of law enforcement. Reggie had returned back to his girlfriend's house and had been unloading items into the house in broad fucking daylight. But when something like this is reported in the news, mostly everybody is paying attention to it, and one neighbor had actually seen Reggie unloading the items from a truck that was described by the police. But the neighbor was also cautious to keep his distance, considering that the police had said that Reggie was armed and dangerous. The neighbor left and drove to the local police department within the neighborhood. While there, they notified the police, gave the accurate descriptions, and it wasn't long before the police arrived on scene and found Reginald Carr in possession of the stolen car, stolen property, and had arrested him, but not before he tried to escape through a bedroom window. They arrested him under the suspicion of 4 counts of murder. Now, Jonathan was not at the same house, and he was at his girlfriend's mother's house, but she was also paying close attention to the news at the time. Considering they were up all night and killed, presumably 5 people, Jonathan was sleeping hard on the couch. When his girlfriend's mother looked further, she found that Jonathan had a huge amount of cash on him and one of the stolen cars located outside of her own home. Obviously, she was scared for her life, so she decided to walk to one of those ancient relics that we don't see too often these days, a payphone, and called the police. Within minutes, the police had arrived on scene with their sirens blazing. This woke Jonathan up and he swung open the front door, hoping to evade capture. He did make it about 3 blocks down the road before the police had finally caught up with him and arrested him for the murders of 4 people. When they told him that, he was dumbfounded because the number was 1 shy of the presumed 5 bodies. Now, both brothers were now in custody, and they showed the suspects to both Monica and Andrew Schreiber, and they confirmed that those were the men who carried out the acts. They even showed pictures of the suspects to Ann Walenta before she passed away, and she confirmed that Reggie was the man who had shot her. This now brought the death toll to 5 people, including Ann. In all, there were 113 counts brought before the both of them. That included different variations of rape, kidnapping, robbery, assault, burglary, 4 counts of capital murder, and 1 count of first-degree murder. Now, the media was having a heyday with this. A conservative commentator and president of the David Horowitz Freedom Center by the name of David Horowitz had criticized the nationwide coverage of the murders as being downplayed because he thought that it was a hate crime considering the 5 murdered victims were white, as were Andrew Schreiber and Monica. Now, this was heavily criticized by the district attorney, Nola Folston, had denied that there was any racial bias between the rape, robbery, and murder charges, as it was chosen as random and only due to what kind of car they drove or the neighborhood that they had lived in. The media was heavily scrutinized as downplaying the charges, but the only people who seemed to push the narrative were members of the conservative media. They talked about how Cornelius Oliver, who had committed 4 murders just days prior, was all over the news, but they didn't commentate much on the brothers whose victims were all white. This was hitting the citizens of Wichita pretty hard, as they were sparking racial tensions between the African American and Caucasian communities. But one thing that I found particularly interesting was a quote from the relative of Rayshonda Wheaton, who was quoted saying, "How could one be any worse than the other if the results were the same?" And I think that that has a pretty good amount of truth to it. Cornelius Oliver was convicted of murdering people who may have been gang affiliated, but the Carr brothers were only looking to get money, and it's worth noting that the one woman who was driving the luxury SUV happened to be Hispanic. So if you think about it, if they actually had gotten to her before she pulled her car into the garage, would the conservative media still be trying to push the racial motivation and trying to spark more tensions between the black and white communities? Probably not. But it's hard to say, but the district attorney still denied that any of these things were racially motivated. But getting back to it, on October of 2002, both brothers stood stoic at their trials, showing little to no remorse for the lives that they had took or the families that they had broken. They were found guilty of all of their respective charges. Reginald was convicted of 50 charges that included rape, robbery, burglary, kidnapping, and murder. And Jonathan was found guilty of all 43 charges that also stemmed from the same atrocities. Both brothers would be sentenced to death, but that was later commuted on July 25th of 2014 to life behind bars with no possibility of parole. Now, if you've been listening to the show for a while now, there's not very many chances that I actually get to share some good news from a story as horrible as this one. But there is a small silver lining to this. Monica testified against the brothers as she survived her injuries, but still lost her friends, which I can't even fathom. But when she was testifying, she actually met Andrew Schreiber, and the two managed to hit it off pretty well. A very unlikely couple from very unfortunate circumstances. But although I can't confirm her identity, Andrew and Monica started dating after the trial and eventually would be married later on. Even something as beautiful as love and marriage stemmed from these horrific encounters. But as it stands right now, Reginald and Jonathan Carr are still behind federal prison walls and will never see the outside world ever again. It is indeed a horrible and harrowing tale of these brothers who had very unfortunate circumstances growing up, but didn't look for outlets to try to get help with their lives and only looked inward to a very, very self-destructive lifestyle and behavior that eventually claimed the lives of 5 people and hurt countless others. Just kind of makes you wonder what would happen if they did get the help that they needed. But we will never know, because these are the facts that are presented to us. If you follow Murder and Such on social media, you saw that I actually delayed this episode by a day. Main reason was because of the racial tensions and the fact that usually when I release episodes on Sunday nights at 10 p.m., a lot of people listen to it on the following Monday. And something just didn't sit right with me for bringing up a topic that had racial divides and tensions and having it release on Martin Luther King Jr. Day. So I hope you understand why I postponed this one, but I do hope that you stuck with me for this episode. But I hope that I presented this in a digestible way, and I thank you for listening. If you would like to follow Murder and Such on all the social media, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Murder and Such. And if you would like to follow me personally, you can find me on Instagram, Twitter, the PlayStation Network, and Snapchat at Huntor27. If you have the capabilities, please leave me a 5-star on Apple Podcasts. Put something like, "Pickles are fucking stupid. I don't care." But it only takes about 30 seconds, and it helps me with trying to get new advertisers. Or if you'd like to help support the show, you can get the show early and ad-free via Patreon at patreon.com/murderandsuch. And you can find the links to all the social media and your favorite podcatchers, as well as the Patreon and PayPal at murderandsuch.com. But I thank you guys for joining me for this episode. I hope you have a fantastic couple of weeks, and I will talk to you soon. Go call a friend.